Heal Me by Embracing Sactric on AO3. Chapter 14. The plan was fucked. What Dabi hated most was that Shigaraki wasn't even the main reason that the plan was fucked. Sure, the idiot went off script and probably made the kid even less cooperative than he already was. But in reality, the plan was fucked from the beginning. He was only just now realizing it, that they had never had a chance to begin with. Dabi had been the only one to suggest recruitment. He had seen potential, a spark of something useful that could be cultivated and encountered in Izuku Midoriya. His conversation with the healer had only cemented that impression of him. Stain would have liked the kid. His ideals and principles would have been enough. But on top of that, Midoriya's quirk was inherently selfless in its use. Stain would have respected him without question. Dabi sort of hoped that one day, somehow, they'd had the chance to meet one another. Whether he liked it or not, Midoriya held the same base ideals as Dabi. They both believed that there needed to be an end of society's false heroes. Of course, they had very different ideas about how that end should be achieved, but that was a whole nother conversation. However, where Midoriya wanted a society with better heroes, Dabi just wanted it all to end. He knew the cycle would just repeat itself, over and over. Each new generation could hold true and noble heroes, but it was just as likely that they'd be standing beside the same batch of corporation and twisted individuals who managed to crawl their way up the ranks. So sure, they held the same base ideas, and at a certain point, their opinions began to diverge, and maybe diverged in very critical ways. That was fine. Evidently, Dabi figured that if they swapped him to their side, then their ideals would come with him. Now, he wasn't so sure. Midoriya's ideals wouldn't flourish with the League of Villains. He'd suppress them. He'd push them down and bury them underneath the hate that would begin to burn brighter in its place. As crazy as it was to consider, the kid could have been more useful to Dabi's own plan when he was with the heroes. He was loath to admit it, but the brat hadn't been completely off base with the suggestion that change could come from within. Dabi had a feeling that someday down the line, Izuku Midoriya would be as much better asset to him as a hero. So, he needed to get the healer back to his heroes. Dabi made his way to an abandoned apartment building, marked for demolition blocks away from the hideout. He stood in its lobby against an old reception desk coated in layers of dust and scattered broken glass. After a quick look around told him that he wouldn't be interrupted by a random squatting hiding in the shadows, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through the eminently short list of contacts it held. His finger finally hovered over a number he never imagined he'd have to call. It had been a bit of a headache tracking down this particular number, along with a few others that Dabi had only ever bothered to keep for scenarios that really only played out in his dreams, or nightmares, depending on how you look at them. He hesitated, his hand beginning to twitch from the strain of holding it so perfectly still while he stared at the contact and wondered how the fuck he had arrived to this point. He selected the contact, held the phone to his ear, and listened to it steadily ring. Hello? The voice cracked a bit and was laced with drowsiness of someone who must have just woken up. Dabi's gaze flicked to one of the lobby's broken windows to see the soft light of dawn flickering through the broken panels and realized how early it was. Dabi prayed the hitch in his breath wouldn't pick up on the phone's mic, and the force of his tone relevant to calm and collected mature he was known for. Little Shouto Todoroki. Dabi finally spoke. How's it going, kid? Who's this? The voice sounded more awake now, alert, with the cautious instinct that had been drilled into its owner. I'll give you a hint, Dabi drawled, snapping his fingers to produce a small blue flame. He watched it flicker and snap, its dust particles floating through the air. If you put our flames together, you might get a nice shade of purple. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Dabi wondered if it was just too early in the morning for clever little puzzles that could have been solved by a toddler. Dabi? Boom! He gets it, Dabi commented, mouth involuntarily twisted in response to the venom he heard in the other boy's voice. Glad to know I'm not speaking with an idiot. What have you done with Midoriya? I'd cut to the chase before you run off to find a hero and trace this call, Dabi carried on. Making his call in the first place may have been a stupidly foolish decision, but he wasn't a complete idiot. He was still a villain seeking with a hero in training. This conversation needed to wrap up quickly. I'm willing to help you get your little green-haired friend back in exchange for a few simple things. What makes you think we'll be willing to negotiate with the League of Villains? Well, first of all, you're not negotiating with the League of Villains. You're only negotiating with me, Dabi corrected. Second of all, I think you'll absolutely be willing to negotiate. Why only you? Shouta questioned, clearly and justified, still skeptical. Does the rest of the League not know you're doing this? Nope, Dabi answered. Let's just say I've been feeling a bit selfish lately. Make no mistake, this whole deal has my best interest in heart. You just happen to have the chance to benefit from it as well. He might have people in the League who he considered comrades, and he'd protect them at a point, but at the end of the day, they were a means to an end, and he was a man for himself. I'll help you get him back, and in exchange, I'm only asking for, let's call it, indirect protection. That means no going after me once you get him back, and no involving the pro heroes. I'll tolerate involving another student if you need it, but that's about it. Why should I trust you? I'm not saying you should. This is just the deal I'm offering, and you could take it or leave it. Dabi started plainly. If Shouto wouldn't take his offer, he'd find another way to get the healer away from the League. This was just the easiest to start with, and maybe a certain brat had made Dabi feel distinguishedly nostalgic. And don't think about trying to have any pro heroes secretly on standby or running to them right after this call. If I get the feeling that things are even slightly off, then I'll turn the kid into a pile of ashes faster than you can fucking blink. There was another bout of silence on the other end, and Dabi let it carry on. He didn't think Shouto was stupid or brash enough to try anything that'll put his friend at risk, and to be fair, this wasn't an easy decision to make on the spot. And if we accept, Shouto finally spoke again, and Dabi grinned. Text me back at this number in 5 minutes, he ordered. I've got a few ideas for how this could work. Without waiting for a response, Dabi ended the call and checked the time. If 5 minutes passed and he had no response, he would ditch the phone and get very far away from this location. If he got a response then, well, things were about to get interesting. Who is that? Fuck! Dabi spun and faced the lobby entrance to see Toga perched on one of its cracked leather chairs that had been pushed up against the wall. Dabi let out a breath and glared at the girl, who only smiled back at him. What are you doing here, Toga? She didn't answer him, and Dabi could tell from her confident silence that she knew she didn't need to answer him. She wasn't the one who was just caught doing something she probably shouldn't be doing. How much did you? All of it, she replied. Dabi took another breath and felt the warmth of his flame simmering just beneath his skin, threatening to spark and defend. He held them back and tried to get a better read on Toga, who was just smiling in an uncharacteristically soft way. Are you going to tell them? Dabi asked, and Toga's expression shifted into something more pensive. I should, shouldn't I? Toga replied as she hopped out of the chair and began to scroll towards Dabi. I should report to Shigaraki because he's the boss. Right, Dabi agreed, voice strained. Toga stopped a couple feet away from him, hands held behind her back as she tilted her head and stared. Dabi didn't know what to think. He and Toga were certainly close than any other of the members of the League, given their shared admiration for Stain. Then again, he was never the kindest to her, and Toga was the type to spill blood whenever she liked you, or not, especially if she liked you. When Shigi used his quirk on you, it made me want to stab him, Toga admitted, her voice more neutral than it usually was. But I knew I shouldn't do that. Do you know why? Because he's the boss, Dabi guessed, with a weary registration going along with the narrative she was trying to establish. Yep, Toga confirmed, the familiar static delight returning on her tone as she flashed her sharpened canines in a grin. But I've never been the biggest fan of having a boss. And sometimes there are worse things you can do to someone than stabbing, even if they aren't as fun and bloody. Dabi paused at that and shot Toga a hesitant look of interest. Oh yeah? Yeah, Toga echoed, like pretending I didn't just hear your phone call. And why would you do that? Dabi questioned. Toga hummed and flicked some of the broken glass off the reception desk. She took a seat on the space she had cleared and began swinging her feet out. I don't think Izuku will do what we want him to do, and Shigi tends to get rid of things that don't do what he wants them to do, Toga told him, grinning at Dabi, a rushy blush blooming on her cheeks. I like Izuku. I want to be able to see him all beaten up and bloody again, and play with him some more. He needs to be alive for that to happen. God, you're such a whack job, Dabi murmured, and Toga giggled in response. And he can't, Toga trailed off, her expression and tone becoming more serious. We get injured, sure, and he can help us out with those moments, but not the moments that really mattered, you know? She looked at Dabi, a strange sort of melodramatic in her eyes. He can't bring back Big Sis Magne, so I don't think he could heal Compress's arm, so not having him wouldn't be the biggest loss. Yeah, I consider that too, Dabi said, with a nod of his head. I'm curious, though. Toga nudged his arm with her elbow. I didn't think you would go soften someone just because they healed you. So what's with the change of heart? Dabi swallowed and thought for a moment. Obviously, he wasn't going to tell her about everything he had talked about with the kid. What the brat had pieced together wasn't even a major reason on why Dabi wanted him away from the League. If anything, it was possible that the reason he did have for wanting to let him go would be something Toga could agree with. I think Stain would have liked him, he said after a moment, and watched Toga's brighten with the mention of the hero killer's name. He's different from the other assholes, mannequined as heroes. I think it would do more harm than good if we tried to manipulate him into helping us. He could serve a better purpose to us if we let him go. And change things from the other side? Toga guessed. Yeah, Dabi agreed, silently impressed that she understood his way of thinking. He glanced down at his arm at the patch of scarred skin that was just slightly different from the rest. Also, fuck Shigaraki, because even with nerve damage, that shit hurt. If he escapes and Shigi finds out you were involved, I've got places where I could lay low, Dabi assured. I was on my own before. It won't be too hard to do it again. Can Twice and I come visit you? What part of on my own are you not getting? But we'll miss you, Toga whined. Dabi huffed out a laugh just as the phone clutched in his hand vibrated. He looked at the screen to see a simple message from a familiar number replying, "We accept." Dabi felt the staples in his face pull as he grinned and glanced up at Toga, showing the girl bore a similar excited smile. "Ready to see shit get fucked?" Shouto looked down at his phone, feeling almost disconnected from his body as it vibrated in his hands with the incoming text message, detailing a plan developed by a known and wanted A-rank villain. He should have gone straight to the faculty members as soon as he realized it was Dabi on the other end of that call. He had just gotten back to sleep in his own room once he was sure Bakugou had settled in his own, but he could hardly blame exhaustion for the ludicrous decision he was currently making. But honestly, Shouto didn't have time to question his life choices. He jumped out of bed and immediately made his way back to Bakugou's room, thanking every force in the universe that it was the weekend and no one else would awake and roaming the halls in this early hours of the morning to see his panicked state. He didn't bother knocking, and he knew that unless Bakugou had gotten up since Shouta had left, the door would still be unlocked. Sure enough, it swung open with ease, and he barged inside, flipping on the lights as he did so. Bakugou was still curled up on the bed where he left him, but he twisted around and blinked his red-rimmed eyes, the sudden harsh brightness of the room. At first, he seemed confused and almost irritated by Shoto's return, but as he took in the boy's flustered appearance, he slowly sat up in bed and stared with an expression that looked almost like concern. "I think I found a way to get Midoriya back," Shouta said, not bothering with any preambles or greetings. Bakugou's eyes widened ever so slightly, and Shoto's gut twisted at the spark of hope he saw in them. There was a plan, sure, but he still needed to express how unhinged of a plan it was. It's stupidly suicidal if it turns out to be a trap, but we can't involve any pro-heroes. But it's a chance. Shouto searched Bakugou's face for any sort of reaction beyond the initial glimmer of hope, but the other boy's gaze had turned distant. For a moment, Shouto worried if his meteoric cell pitch had sent him into another episode, until he realized Bakugou's glare wasn't just distant. It was like he was looking through Shouto, almost like he was looking right past him through the open door. Shouto turned and came face to face with Shinso, still slightly bruised, but bandaged, and mostly healed. Standing in the hall behind him, Shinso glanced between Shouto and Bakugou, brows raised. "Should I pretend that I didn't just hear all that?" Shinso asked, half-heartedly waving a finger in Shoto's direction. Shouto sucked in a breath and grabbed Shinso by the collar, dragging him into Bakugou's room. He quickly glanced up and down the hall to check the rest of it was empty before shutting the door and sealing the three of them inside. "Whoa now, I won't say anything," Shinso quickly promised, hands held up in the air in a passive gesture. "No threats necessary. My lips are sealed." "I appreciate it," Shouto acknowledged, and truly meant it. He should have been more aware of his surroundings before saying what he had out loud. If someone like Yaoyorozu or Iida had been around to hear it, more than likely they would have gone straight to a teacher. He looked Shinso up and down, and nothing about how the boy looked improved in some ways, but even more destroyed in others compared to how he was before leaving Aizawa. "How'd the report to the principal go?" "For starters, it wasn't just the principal," Shinso corrected with a grimace. "Didn't realize I needed to tell the retired symbol of peace that I watched someone he considered family get kidnapped by villains." "Todoroki." Shouto's head whipped back to stare at Bakugou, questioning if he really just heard the other boy use his real name. Bakugou never used real names. He had nicknames for almost everything and everyone. It never mattered whether he liked you or hated you. It was a simple fact, and Shouto had never really figured out what it took to get him to use their real names. There were only a few exceptions, like Midoriya or occasionally Kirishima, but never Shouto. Bakugo was looking down at his hands as he methodically clenched them and unclenched them. Shouta recognized it as one of his grounding techniques, an action he did whenever he was focused and trying to think despite any chaos around him or within him. Do you really have a way of getting him back? Bakugo asked, glaze rising to meet Shouto's. It's risky, Shouta confessed, unwilling to sugarcoat their chances. Has that ever really stopped you guys in the past? Shinzo pointed out. Now that I think about it, you could help us out. Shouto mused, as he looked back down on his phone and scrolled through the messages Dabi had sent him. I realize you're already facing consequences for sneaking out. If we were caught, things would just get worse for you. I'm in, Shinzo declared, without hesitation. Just tell me what to do. You don't. Shouto and Shinzo both looked up at the sound of Bakugo's voice, and the other boy staring at Shinzo with strangely sympathetic look on his face. Bakugo's expression twisted, and he looked back down at his hands. It's not your fault he was taken. You don't need to help and put yourself more at risk at some sort of apology. I'm helping because I want to get Midoriya back, Shinzo told him, voice firm as Bakugo looked back up and met his gaze. And I think that's a motivator we could all agree on. They stared at one another for a few moments before Bakugo sighed, tilted his head side to side to crack the joints of his neck, and he looked back to Shouto. That familiar fire had returned in his eyes, and Shouto nearly grinned at the sight of it, only now realizing how wrong it had been to see it absent in the first place. What's the plan? This is basically just a bunch of build-up for the next chapters to come. I still love this chapter, do not get me wrong. I love a good build-up. In fact, building up to a story is absolutely necessary. But on a point that isn't the fanfic, my voice hurts. Having to do so many characters, I had to do 4 characters this chapter, but having to do so many characters, and especially Dabi and Toga switching, it hurts my voice. Because Toga's is a very high pitch, it's in the nose, it's very much, has a twinge of like pitch into it, like a squeak into it a bit. And then we go into Dabi's, which is a more calm, down in the throat, more of a less emotional kind of voice, which is having to switch from high pitch to low pitch on a flip of a switch apparently hurts voices. So yeah, I'm working on vocal exercises to be able to control my voice a bit more. I'm drinking a bunch of water, I'm drinking tea, I'm making sure my voice does not get killed or some shit. I am practicing voicing exercises, mainly just to help out my voice range and be able to do better voices. I have the acting part kind of down, I just need to do better voices. More range, just to have more distinct voices for each character. But yeah, I'm working hard to get you guys better content. So that 1 hour in my morning every day of my weird vocal exercises goes out to you guys, my raindrops. As always, make sure to eat, sleep, take your meds, have a wonderful day or night. Join our community server, link is in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.